Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and a big warm welcome to a very, very cold night, but hopefully warm evening inside Wentworth Woodhouse. Tonight is the Clifford Newbold Memorial Lecture. I'm sure most of you know that Clifford Newbold was the last private owner of the house, and a lot of the work that he did preserved an awful lot of the building. He actually lived in some of the rooms which currently have historic wallpapers inside them. And I'm delighted that tonight we can welcome an online audience, yourselves obviously, and Dr. Phillipa Mapes to talk about wallpaper manufacture and use in the long 18th century. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Phillipa Mapes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody. You can all hear me, I think. Yes, perfect. I've got my reading glasses on, and then I'm going to look over like that. So if I go a little bit dizzy, then somebody can leap up. And anyway, good evening, and thank you very much for coming along to this talk on wallpapers in England in the long 18th century. Why Pride and Prejudice is the title to my talk. A little spin on contemporary Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, but I'm going to talk about the production and use of wallpapers in Britain during this period and how British-made wallpapers became a cause of national pride. I'm going to talk for about 55 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for some questions at the end. Well, it's great to see so many people here today who are actually interested in wallpapers, because many of us generally take wallpaper for granted. It's something that is literally in the background. But there is more to wallpaper history than that. If we take a closer look at the developing use of wallpapers in the home, it can actually tell us a lot about the wider social and cultural changes that took place in society in the past. So to explore this further, let's ask ourselves, do we really need wallpapers? Aren't they just pretty, non-functional, purely just a decorative ornament with which to adorn our walls? In this respect, we can regard them as luxury items, not necessary to life in general. So when they have been bought and used in the home in the past, what does this tell us about people's living standards and their spending choices at the time? Also, by exploring the changing ways in which wallpapers were manufactured in this period, we can see a direct link to how available they were and therefore who could afford to have them in their homes. So let's begin at the start of wallpaper history. There are fragments of wallpapers in our museums dating back to 1509. That's the earliest fragment that we found that we know so far, and this was found in Christ's College, Cambridge. It's now in the Victoria and Albert Museum. There you go. They've all got captions to them for further reference, but they're not quite sitting on that, if that's okay. Please ask me afterwards if you want to know what they are and they're not coming up on the screen. So this is a black and white pomegranate design, designed by Hugo Gose. And at this time, methods of printing wallpaper, which were called paper hangings, consisted of stenciling using patterns cut from leather, oilcloth or card, and block printing from woodcuts. Usually carbon black ink was used to wood block print the outline, and water-based paints, often red, yellow, orange, green or blue, were brushed on the ground through stencils. There we go. It'll just probably be the longer ones. We can see here this landscape design printed with a black outline and coloured with red, blue and green, these very, very thin watercolour-based paints that have now faded. So although we have examples from 1509, wallpaper didn't really come into popular use in the 18th century until although we have examples from 1509, wallpapers didn't really come into popular use until the 18th century had started. To this point, wallpaper manufacture was still a small trade associated with the cheap decoration of poorer class homes. A broadside of 1712 stated, those that buy and make use of the said manufacture, i.e. wallpapers, are generally persons of low and mean circumstances. And we can see that these quite rudimentary, naive, simple prints were typical of the time and not necessarily something that a rich person would use to grace their house. They were often printed on single sheets of handmade paper and often randomly pasted or nailed to the wall or used to line coffers and chests. So they might sort of hang a few bits up, nail it up to the wall just as a little bit of decoration, like we might pin up a poster or something like that, not comprehensively used around a room. And at the time, for the more wealthy homeowner, their options for ornamenting their walls consisted of much more accomplished decorations, such as hand-painted designs on plaster, or the more expensive options of wood panelling, leather hangings, or textile hangings, such as tapestries, rich brocades, and damasks imported from abroad. However, around the late 17th and early 18th century, there began the practice of sticking these single sheets of handmade paper together end to end to form a printable length. So if you had a square of handmade paper and you stuck that with a little margin down to another one, you're beginning to get a drop that we recognize as a roll of wallpaper. And here we are. The British Museum has this beautiful detailed trade card from Abraham Price and his blue paper warehouse, which shows some lovely details about the making and selling of wallpaper around this early 18th century period. So the description below lists the different sorts of designs that were available through this particular shop. And here we see Abraham Price strutting about in the front of his shop, beckoning customers in. And we can see on the top left the people who were printing the wallpapers, the craftsmen who were printing the wallpapers with wooden printing blocks, and they're using a mallet to impress the block into the paper. And hand printing by woodblock became the main method of manufacture from this date onwards, because it was more robust and longer lasting than oilcloth or thick card stencils. So here's an example of a relief woodblock. Excuse me. And the wooden block was carved with the pattern raised up like a potato cut, as you can see here. And when you press the block onto a surface that was coated with paint, like an old stamp pad type, old-fashioned stamp pad, the paint is then picked up on the raised parts of the design, and that is then transferred onto the paper, and it prints the raised parts only. And this hand printing method remained pretty much the same until right the way through until the 19th century, which is why I can get away with showing you a 19th century printing block for those eagle-eyed people who've spotted a William Morris pattern there. So, meanwhile, in wider society, the 18th century was a period of rising prosperity in Britain, a period of commercial expansion at home and abroad. And part of this vibrant, exploratory and dynamic century was a real spirit of entrepreneurialism. At this time, we imported a lot of luxury items from abroad for sale to the wealthy. But during the 18th century, we looked towards supporting our own crafts and trades and making our own versions of these luxury goods instead. This was a period of great invention and rising prosperity in Britain across several trades. Britain was at the start of her industrial revolution, producing new goods and new versions of familiar goods, using new materials and developing new ways of manufacturing all sorts of domestic items, such as glassware, pottery, metalware, textile fabrics, and of course, wall coverings. Wallpaper manufacturers were amongst this entrepreneurial group, and in the early decades of the 18th century, they began producing imitations of expensive fabrics for the very rich, but this time on paper. So For example, velvet wall hangings imported from abroad were imitated by printing on paper using flock fibres or chopped wool. So not the invention of an Indian restaurant in the 20th century, but in fact a much earlier cultural phenomenon. And in this slide here, we can see two colours there. There's the background, which is termed in wallpaper terminology the ground, and this was painted on. And when that was dry, the pattern was printed by carved wooden block, not in paint, but in adhesive, over which chopped wool fibres would be scattered. And when they were dry, obviously they would adhere only to the adhesive areas. You could pick up the paper, shake off the excess, and there you were with the pattern revealed in flock, a bit like the Blue Peter glitter Christmas card technique that some of you may remember. Same principle, same principle. Coloured flock fibres were used, often reds, greens, yellows or blues, creating either a two-tone effect, as we see here, or in a contrasting colour to the background. And by this method, flock fibres could convincingly imitate the raised textural effects of cut velvets, damask weaves and brocade fabrics that were fashionable amongst the elite classes as coverings for their walls. So you can see that that could look, background's a bit faded now, it's pink, it would have been a much darker red, but you can see how that would very much replicate a textile of the time. Now, whilst these wallpapers were still expensive, they were considerably cheaper than the fabrics that they imitated, and wealthy 18th century shoppers loved these papers, not just because they were cheaper, but also for their novelty value. So, you know, this was a brand new thing. Is it a textile? Oh, no, it's a wallpaper. It was very cheeky in its deceptiveness, you know, something that you could tell your friends when they came to say, it's actually paper. So, you know, it had that sort of appeal of novelty and newness that was very much an 18th century phenomenon. And King George I had a flock wallpaper hung in Kensington Palace in the 1720s. So then, of course, anybody who could afford one had to have one as well. So flock wallpapers were part of the 18th century fashion for new novel textural effects in domestic goods. And because they were so well made and convincing, they soon became popular in the homes of the elite and gentry. As the writer and illustrator W.H. Pine retrospectively commented in his royal residences in the early 19th century, this soon led to the adoption of so cheap and elegant a manufacture in preference to the original material from which it was copied. So taking over it in popularity and fashion from the actual textile hangings themselves. So we can see that wallpapers are really beginning to make their mark as a decorative option around the first half of the 18th century. So running parallel to the success of flock wallpapers from the early 18th century onwards was the fashion for Chinese export wallpapers, and no history of the 18th century wallpaper in England is complete without mentioning these fabulous and colourful designs. These wallpapers were hand painted in China, specifically for export markets to Europe. These wallpapers were part of a larger trade in all things Chinese, such as porcelain and silk and lacquerware, and other domestic products that had become fashionable in Western homes at this time. They were handled by the East India Company, who had a monopoly on trade with China during the 18th century, and as such, Chinese wallpapers are often referenced in country house archives as India papers. Again, every self-respecting member of the landed gentry would have at least one room papered in these beautiful wallpapers in a fashion that lasted on and off well into the 19th century. Subject matter was broadly divided into three categories. Firstly, landscape scenes with Chinese people going about daily life and trade. So there you can see various things going on in a typical Chinese landscape. This example is from Blickling Hall. The second category is known as the bird and flower group. consisting of patterns featuring birds and flowers, based around the motif of the flowering tree of life. So that would be a with, excuse me, sorry, sinuous tree, winding up with various flowers and birds situated in it, with these trees decorated all around the room in a non-repeating pattern. And the third category was a sort of combination of both. So that is a mixture of people and the flowering tree pattern, slightly out of scale. The people are either very small or very large, but these were the perspective and stylistic devices of Chinese painters were not something that we were used to in the Western world, and that was something that was also a little bit different and exotic. And these designs allowed wealthy Western customers to journey to these exotic worlds and experience new and unusual flowers and plants and animals, as well as obviously the costumes, the architecture and lifestyle of this far off and seemingly strange land, all from the comfort of their own home. These exquisitely hand-painted wallpapers were often decorated with minute details painted with a single hair brush, and they became much sought-after status symbols amongst the wealthy classes in England and also in Europe. Chinese wallpapers could cost some 20 times more than a flock wallpaper, and as such, they really were the proviso of the very wealthy at this time. It's worth mentioning that the Oriental materials and paints used on these wallpapers were very strong and long-lasting despite their fragile appearance, and this meant that many of these wallpapers still look fresh today. So if looked after properly, Chinese wallpapers could continue to look vibrant and attractive for many decades. And so they often became almost part of the heritage of a stately home, like an heirloom piece. And it's not unusual for them to be taken down and rehung in another of the family's properties elsewhere, or finding them for sale in auction houses where they could still command a price several years later on because of the way that they were made and the way that they lasted very well. We can see many of these wallpapers in situ in historic houses open to the public today. So I don't know if any of you have seen them, but quite often many stately homes have got one of these Chinese wallpapers somewhere. And they've lasted more than any other style from the 18th century period. Well, by the middle of the 18th century, fashion styles in Britain were beginning to change towards much lighter and brighter styles, like delicate florals and chintzes, and moving away from the heavy formal patterns and materials that we've seen in the luxurious flock wallpaper designs. The influence of Chinese wallpapers and Chinese design certainly played a part in this, with their open, delicate and airy style, and this less formal aesthetic was also reinforced at the time by a fashion for the light and sinuous swirls and informality of the Rococo. For British wallpaper manufacturers, they were keen to uphold their reputation and continue their commercial success that they'd enjoyed with flock wallpapers. So they began to look at ways that they could copy these lighter fabrics as well by using paint rather than heavy wool flock. This was found in the medium of distemper paint. Distemper is chalk, glue size, and a coloured pigment. So the ground layer was brushed onto the background, as with flock wallpapers, but then the design was created by successively printing one colour at a time over the last until the pattern was built up. So here we have a detailed example. You can see how the dark colours, if you look on the right, you can see how the dark colour printed over the lighter colours to create depth, opacity, and a sort of 3D effect. It's much thicker, full-bodied paint than those early watercolored paints that we saw in the first example that were quite thin and thinly bodied. This is much more of an opaque, solid look. And we can see the same technique using this overprinting on this decorative border here. So you can see more of a three-dimensional effect. So that is supposed to imitate a carved dado rail, something similar to that, which obviously that's a close-up, but from a distance that would have a trompe-l'oeil effect, which is created by this overprinting. So this method of printing with carved wooden block was also modified at this time to ensure a better and more efficient result, as we can see from this trade card from Ballard and Co. This dates from the later 18th century. But if we remember the slide of Abraham Price and his blue paper warehouse, where the workers were pressing the carved wooden blocks onto the paper and hitting them on the back with a mallet to help impress the printing medium onto the paper, this has been replaced by a more effective foot-operated lever. And every printer had his boy, and he would prepare the stamp pad basically to the printer's right there. He's coating that in the appropriate color that is required. Ballard is then charging his block with onto the pad and then bringing it over and operating his lever and making a good contact with that and really printing that thick distemper pigment. So by the mid-18th century, wallpaper manufacturers had perfected this hand block printing craft, and their wallpapers were in increasing demand. Manufacturers had their flagship stores based in the fashionable luxury goods shopping streets of London. This one is Cheapside in London, which cheap in that period meant market or trade or something, rather than the connotation that we have now of thinking of it as something that's a little bit shoddy. So this was one of the fine shopping streets, and you can see fine 18th century ladies and gentlemen perusing goods and generally promenading up and down. And wallpaper manufacturers had their premises in Cheapside and other celebrated shopping streets in London at the time, and they would also send out their wallpapers to shops in regional centres, and you could even order them by mail coach. And here is a trade card of one such manufacturer, James Wheely, who had his workshop and shop in Little Britain. This is his trade card from the 1760s, 1770s. And you can see Wheely, again, it's the same sort of format, you know, proudly showing a fashionably dressed couple some samples from a well-stocked shop. And English wallpapers were all the rage amongst fashionable Europeans as well. At this point, as with our other manufactured domestic goods, Britain was blazing a trail in Europe, North America, and also our other colonies and other countries as well, with a successful international export trade. Beautiful and skillful effects of English wallpapers were a source of national pride at this time. The French writer Madame de Genlis commented in 1760 that the French elite wore nothing but English dresses and had taken down their expensive French tapestries in favour of hanging English wallpapers in their place. But let's take a closer look at exactly who James Wheely and his contemporaries were selling to. With these successful flagship stores in the fashionable shopping streets of London and their networks of trade, their customers must have extended further than the small market of the elite and gentry. So who was actually buying wallpaper at this time? As mentioned, the 18th century was a period of economic expansion in Britain. The period saw prosperity and the size of the population increase hugely. Many people moved to existing or newly created towns for manufacturing work, and this had a knock-on effect as other trades and professions such as shopkeepers, doctors, bankers, teachers and servants moved to towns to support these growing urban areas. It was a period of great building booms across Britain. In fact, the supply of building materials often outran demand. One story has it that in one case, bricks were delivered to the building site still hot from the brick kilns, so hot, in fact, that they set fire to the cart on which they were delivered. A feature of these new houses was a smooth plastered rather than a wood panelled finish to the interior walls, which of course were ideally suited to the hanging of wallpaper. And the new middle classes had some money to spend. They had homes to decorate, and they had a keen eye on fashion. The acquisition of luxury and semi-luxury goods for the home became a preoccupation for this broad group of middle classes, as having such things was seen as a mark of status. Fashion was the key to this, and it was important to have the latest style of new carpet, furniture, window curtains, and wallpaper, as well as new clothes. So here we can see this contemporary print, satirical print, Captain Jessamy learning the proper discipline of the couch, showing a typical interior from, this is dated 1782, with all the mod cons, fashionable way of dressing the window with these new curtains, fashionable carpet, fashionable wallpaper, fashionable clothes and furniture. So the key to being able to produce wallpapers for the very wealthy, as well as the less wealthy but much larger group of the middle classes, lay in the wallpaper printing process itself. So as we've seen, the different colours making up each design had to be printed separately, one on top of the other to build up the design. Each different colour had to be printed by a separate block and the colour allowed to dry between printings. Pattern was registered correctly by means of brass marker pins located in the corner of every block. So they had a little pin and you would line up the pins as you printed each block one on top of the other after the previous colour had dried. So the more coloured details that were required in a design, the more blocks needed to be carved, and carving the blocks was one of the more skilled and expensive elements of the process. And of course, the more time required to dry between printings. So on this example, beautiful multicolored arabesque style wallpaper from the end of the 18th century. This would have required many blocks to be carved to produce all the different fine colored details in the design. So you can see many colors there, all would have required a separate block to be carved in order to print them. However, block printing method was really useful for manufacturers because it gave them flexibility as to how simple or complex they wanted to make their designs. And this, of course, affected the price. So let's have a look at an example. There we go. So we see here that this limited color printing produces a simple but pretty design that would grace anybody's wall. So on the right there, I mean, that's nice enough, isn't it? Sort of Laura Ashley kind of flower thing. It only requires 2 blocks to be cut. But if we add more colours and details using more printing blocks, see, we're building it up, that's looking a bit nicer, isn't it? And then another one, you can see how what would be this bottom right hand one would be a much more expensive wallpaper to buy because of the work involved than the top right. And if you really wanted to switch out, then you could have some gold as well. So that would be the most expensive, obviously. This meant, of course, that the printing process made it possible for wallpapers to be sold at a range of prices from several pence per yard to several shillings per yard. This way, they could sell wallpapers with simple patterns and small designs at a cheaper price to a much larger consumer group than just the very rich. As wallpaper was becoming a must-have decorative item for the upwardly mobile, status-conscious middle-class homeowners, manufacturers by the second half of the 18th century were therefore producing very characteristic, simple patterns for the time, including stripes, small-scale floral patterns, trellis patterns, and motifs known as diaper patterns, which were all easy and economical to print and readily available in a range of prices. So here we are. Here's a typical example of a sort of trellisy. There's lots of diamondy formats with motifs in between, and a leaf, flower and foliage patterns here. This is Jane Austen's house. I'm just jotting in the Pride and Prejudice references wherever I go here. But this is very typical of wallpapers that were produced round about the end of the 18th century. And this is a reproduction they actually found in Jane Austen's house, a fragment of the original wallpaper, and this was reproduced by Hamilton Weston Wallpapers based on the original design. So these, yes, this is small scale trellisy patterns, and little flowers and leaves were particularly popular at this period. So we've seen how manufacturers in the second half of the 18th century shaped the type of wallpaper designs they were printing for commercial reasons. But let's have a look now at why these wallpaper designs were so popular on an aesthetic level from the consumer's point of view. As is often the case, art imitates life, and we can think about this in relation to wallpaper pattern choices at the time. And we can actually see contemporary cultural influences reflected in the designs of 18th century wallpapers. Choices of what wallpaper to buy were influenced by middle-class social values and the desire to display the virtues of taste, simplicity, nothing too showy, and of personal improvement. By the third quarter of the 18th century onwards, rationality and restraint were expressed in wallpaper design through the neoclassical tenets of harmony, symmetry, and simplicity, as a reaction to what was seen as the indulgence and excesses of the Rococo. Styles influenced by Greco-Roman art and architecture experienced on the Grand Tour were suggestive of a knowing, cultured, and enlightened consumer. And even if you weren't wealthy enough to go on the Grand Tour, in person, you could suggest that you knew all about it through your choice of wallpaper. So here we have neoclassical influences, the Roman laurel wreath motif on the left, scrolling acanthus leaves on the right, set in a pillar and vertical ornament style. So very, very much echoes of neoclassical styling there. And this vertical pillar format that we're seeing on both of these was used again and again in wallpapers from the late 18th and early 19th century in a style that recognized as the Regency stripe. Other cultural movements at the time included the Enlightenment ideals of self-improvement, rationality, and scientific reason, and these also permeated into the choices for domestic decoration. In society, these ideals were displayed by the middle and upper classes in a growing interest in learning, scientific lectures, and memberships of societies and libraries that were blossoming in these new urban areas. Whether consciously or unconsciously, this was reflected in people's domestic choices of ornament. So, for example, a growing interest in the development of science and mathematical instruments, including the microscope, were translated into simple patterned wallpapers, such as those illustrated here. So you can see these sort of amoeba type shapes at the beginning to it. These are kind of random shapes that wouldn't have been used before. They're not traditional devices, traditional motifs that would have been known prior to this period, but you see quite a lot of these developing, these sort of blobby motifs that became fashionable. Also, part of being a fashionable, respectable, and status-conscious middle-class person in the 18th century was an interest in the new food and drink products that became available at this time, including tea, coffee, and hot chocolate. It became very fashionable for ladies to entertain their friends or people they wanted to impress for tea. The tea ceremony was an opportunity for the non-working upper and middle class lady to show off to polite society her fashionable home and her knowledge of good manners and etiquette through the furnishings of her house, including its wallpapered walls and her display of teacups, teapots and tea tables, as well as familiarity with the new drink itself. So this wallpaper is from a private collection. We only have fragments surviving of it, but you can see that this concept is taken to the nth degree. Not only have they chosen a wallpaper to express their status, but they're also name checking and saying, you know, I know all about tea as well. Got wallpaper, I know about tea. So it's very much a status, a statement about status and wealth and your understanding of what the current mores are at the time, very much designed to impress. However, although block printed wallpapers had come within the reach of the new broad group of middle classes in the 18th century, they were still moderately expensive, too expensive for poorer households. And one of the reasons for this was the fact that wallpaper was subject to VAT throughout the whole century. The tax, averaging at 1 3/4 pence per yard, was paid on each roll, which measured a standard length of 12 yards. The manufacturer had to pay the tax themselves upfront, and this cost was passed on to the consumer at point of sale. This therefore kept the price of wallpapers out of the reach of those on very modest incomes, because the manufacturers themselves could not sell the product for lower than the tax that they had already paid on it up front. The whole taxing process as well was very time consuming. It was very difficult to enforce and extremely complicated. So no changes there then. But we had to wait until the 19th century before the government agreed that the tax was holding back the industry from expanding further to sell wallpapers to the poorer working classes. And it was only by 1836 that the tax was abolished. So they were unable to expand their markets to the working classes or less affluent classes. So in the meantime, manufacturers continued to look at ways to produce wallpapers more cheaply, so that they could sell to a wider market with these simple small-scale patterns in limited colours. Alongside this, they also continued to produce the expensive, complex and multicoloured wallpapers, like the one we saw earlier. I'll just pop that up. So they're producing these expensive wallpapers, but much of their efforts were spent on volume of sales rather than courting the more limited market of the elite customer. And by the end of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the English wallpaper trade began to be associated more with these simple, cheaper patterns rather than the lavish, expensive designs that they'd previously built their reputation on. So I'm just going to finish off a little bit early, but plenty of time for questions. I'm just going to finish off by talking a little about another type of wallpaper that was popular in England by the end of the 18th and early 19th century, and that is wallpapers from France. So whilst our wallpaper trade was concentrating on these small-scale designed wallpapers for the larger middle-class market, France's wallpaper trade was in the ascendant. They were a few decades behind us in the development, but they certainly caught up with a vengeance. France was our old rival. We'd been at war with the French on and off for the whole of the 18th century, and during the 7 Years' War with France, 1757 to 1763, commercial transactions with Britain ceased, providing the incentive for French manufacturers to develop their own trade. Manufacturing conditions in France in the late 18th and early 19th centuries were different to those in England, and specifically London, which was the main centre of wallpaper production at this time. In London, labour was much more expensive than in France. Plus, we had the onerous wallpaper tax system that kept the price of wallpaper high, regardless of its quality. And these factors meant that the French could produce better quality, more artistic and more complex wallpapers much more cheaply than we could at this time. So we remember the comment from earlier that Madame Jean-Lee made about how English fashions were all the rage in France. Well, by the end of the 18th century, the tables had turned and French culture and styles were very, very fashionable. Parisian taste in particular was very influential, not just in Britain, but also increasingly internationally. In contrast to the simple two-dimensional patterns which many English manufacturers were now concentrating their production on, French wallpapers represented a fresh new approach to wallpaper design in which artists depicted more naturalistic subjects, flora and fauna, and created trompe-l'oeil effects of a much more vibrant and sumptuous nature. So you can see here the difference between our simple designs at this time and their more lavish ones. Subjects included large pictorial renditions from classical antiquity and scenes of both grand buildings and lush exotic landscapes designed to continue around the walls of entire rooms in non-repeating panoramas. They also produced arabesque designs, which were particularly fashionable in Britain in the 1780s and 1790s, such as the fabulous example we have here from the Green Dining Room at Wentworth Woodhouse, produced by Jean-Baptiste Réveillon, with vases of flowers, urns, decorative elements framed within cartouches and mounted in panels between plain and decorative borders. So we can see that these are much more realistic and naturalistic methods of printing, building up several layers to create the effect of flowers, flora and fauna, and the use of bright contrasting colours such as greens, blues, crimsons, many using many carved printing blocks, and a complete contrast to our flat, highly stylized versions of flowers and rigidly neoclassical inspired columns and stripes favoured by the English manufacturers by the end of the 18th century. Now, we can obviously expect these popular French imports to have been purchased by a more wealthy customer, so this would have been really, really expensive wallpaper. But adverts for French wallpapers in British newspapers towards the end of the 18th and early 19th century indicate that there was also a large market in Britain for French wallpapers. So there are lots of adverts, lots of shops saying that they're selling French wallpapers. They've got the latest consignment from France, etc. Indeed, some English manufacturers had close links with France, and some French craftsmen, including Réveillon himself, settled in England during the late 18th and early 19th century. So there are some strong cultural influences there, an exchange of ideas and techniques and skills. So, in conclusion, we've sort of come full circle in our look at wallpapers in the long 18th century, from its early beginnings as a rustic decoration to winning domestic and international success with our flock and distemper printed wallpapers in the mid to late century, to our concentration latterly on producing simple and cheaper designs by the end of the century, played out against our competition with our old adversary, the French. It's important to note, however, that we did continue to produce beautiful, colourful, complex, expensive designs at the high-end range of the market, alongside the larger market for simple designs. It's also important to see the beauty in these simplified, elegant, pleasing designs for their own sake, though, and to recognise their contribution in making wallpaper an affordable luxury item for a much larger part of the population. Although it wasn't until the 19th century that industrialization and technical advances made wallpaper an affordable commodity for all classes in society, the long 18th century set the trend, the desire, and the tradition for us to decorate our homes with beautiful and pleasing wallpapers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. We've got time for questions now. So does anybody have anything that they'd like to ask Phillipa? Yeah, I'll just pass the mic to you so you can all hear the question.
You showed a couple of examples of the arabesque pattern. When I think of arabesque, I think of ballet dancers, sort of,
Yeah.
Do you know why it was called that, those particular designs? Why was it called arabesque?
I don't know.
Oh, right. Okay.
I don't. No, I don't know why it was called arabesque. But no, I would only be hazarding a guess. Nothing to do with ballet, but a style from it. I would imagine that perhaps the ballet had taken its inspiration from that. Yeah, and also, I mean, there were lots of cultural influences from different countries as well. So I would imagine that it's probably come from a cultural influence that it isn't English. So we were using all sorts of patterns, copying motifs and things from other countries at the time as we opened up our exploration of the world. I can find out for you, though.
Oh, yeah, okay, be good. I've got another question. So once you've bought your wallpaper, who would be the person responsible for putting it up? Did it need a specialist craftsman, or would it be just a labourer on an estate?
It depends how much money you had. So you would buy it from a shop. So if you bought it from a high-end London shop, they would probably say, and would you like us to send somebody to hang it? And they would hang it for you. If you were having a whole house done out, you probably have an architect and what they called an upholder as well. So Thomas Chippendale, for example, supplied furniture. He would also supply wallpapers and somebody to hang them. One of his men would go up and work wherever over the country, hanging these up. So again, it would depend. There's also local hangers would hang them, but this is quite a new method of decorating your walls, and sometimes they didn't quite know how to do it. So you can see some fairly random methods of hanging, and when you're doing wallpaper conservation, you can find some really strange things. Why have they done this? And oh, they've just stuffed that up there, and so they, it wasn't a craft that we would recognize today. So a bit ad hoc, but yes, the very rich would have somebody come, probably supplied by the person they bought the wallpaper from.
Thank you. I had a question from the online audience. Is there anything that you can tell us about the kind of adhesives that would have been used?
Yes. So if you were hanging a heavy flock wallpaper, you'd be more likely to use a animal glue. Yes, so just boiled up animal glue, because that's really quite strong. Otherwise, it was just plain flour and water paste.
Okay. Any more questions from the room? Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. You mentioned earlier about the carvings of the blocks. Would they be part of the business themselves, or would they go out to particular carvers? And who would originate the design? Was it all in-house, or was it separate units that came together?
You would the larger manufacturers would have an in-house department. So what they quite often did was you would buy a pattern, and then you would dissect that pattern into the individual blocks that needed printing, and then your block carver would carve that for you. And he was obviously paid more than the person who brushed the ground on, or who rolled up the finished papers, or worked in the shop, or the boy that painted on the. So yes, most of the large manufacturers by the end of the 18th century had a department where they would have the blocks carved. And if you were a small independent manufacturer, you would do that yourself with varying degrees of skill. Also, because it was quite a dynamic dynamic economic time in the 18th century, quite a lot of people set up business, went bankrupt. So there were quite often sales of blocks. You could buy a second-hand block. So you didn't actually have to know the technique of wood carving, which is obviously a skill. You could just buy a block and then you're just doing that, which takes some skill, but it's not as skilled as the block carving. So you could set up quite cheaply with second-hand blocks.
Any more from the room? Yep.
Was there any overlap of the blocks between textile block printing and wallpaper block printing? Like, could you use the same blocks to create similar patterns?
That's a good question, because we don't know very much about that, to be honest. They're different sizes, so I think that was actually quite difficult. There would definitely be an overlap in the kind of in the craftsmen that you could use to carve them. So quite a lot of manufacturers in the 18th century also had interests in calico printing. So they might own a calico printing business and a wallpaper printing business. Two techniques very similar. So you could have your one skilled craftsman carving the blocks, but I don't think they were interchangeable because they came in different printable sizes. So you couldn't necessarily use them for both. But in terms of skill sets and personnel, they'd be interchangeable. Yeah, pretty interchangeable.
Okay. Anyone else? Did people catch that one? Will I say? Did you catch that? No. Shall I carry on with it? Right. So the question was, what sort of dyes did they use for printing? So generally you would use a mineral pigment, a pigment that you could grind up, and then you can put that with your chalk to get this bodied texture. So a dye would be more for a textile, unless you were producing a lake pigment, which is a dye precipitated onto a solid pigment. But in the early watercolor ones, they would use a dye, but later on for the distemper, a solid mineral pigment was more useful. And synthetic dyes, as you mentioned, were a 19th century invention then. So then the sky was the limit. Yes. And of course, if you wanted to print something really cheaply, you would pick a cheap pigment. So that was quite handy for the interest in neoclassical inspired wallpapers, because they're very much imitations of masonry. So cheap pigments, carbon, yellow, ochre, earth pigments, which were much cheaper than other more colourful pigments.
You spoke about the Chinese wallpapers being hung on battens and stretchers and fixed onto sort of hessian on the walls. Certainly we know that was happening in the 1770s, and a house quite near here, it was taken down in 1850 and rediscovered and hung again in a different room in about 2003. At what point did that become old-fashioned and they started to hang the wallpaper actually on the wall, as we tend to do today, thinking in mind of the Green Dining Room here at Wentworth?
Sorry, is the question when did they decide?
When did it sort of swap from hanging it on hessian and battens and stretchers,
right? Okay.
Hanging it actually on the wall?
Yes. Okay. So hanging it on stretchers was a solution that your upholder would come up with to hang over your panelled walls, because you can't stick it. So if you imagine trying to wallpaper over that, it would be all lumpy bumpy. But if you put a wooden stretcher around there, stretch a textile over that, you've then created a flat surface for yourself to hang the wallpaper on. So you would upholster the wall, and your upholder would do that for you. So it's just a response to a rough wall behind, and obviously that became less of a thing when they started building new houses with just plain plaster walls. Paneling wasn't fashionable anymore, so any new builds would have a plain plaster wall. Stretching canvas over panelled walls was a response to a much more historic wall structure in a stately home that was built centuries earlier.
And another one from our online crowd. Roughly what time, what period of time would you say that the manufactured wallpapers overtook the creation of hand-printed wallpapers?
There's quite a clear point at which that happened, really, was when they abolished the tax on wallpaper in 1836. Then it became more cost effective for manufacturers to invest in machinery to print wallpapers. And the wallpaper tax meant that you had to, the lengths of wallpaper had to be a specific length, which was the 12 yards, and each 12-yard length had to be stamped with a stamp by the tax inspector. And that meant that they couldn't use the technology which had already been invented at the beginning of the 19th century, which was continuous paper. So they couldn't feed these short lengths into a machine and expect it to print, because it just, it wasn't working. So once the tax was abolished, they didn't need to cut the wallpaper, the paper lengths up into 12-yard pieces. They could use continuous paper. It then became viable to develop a calico printing machine to print wallpapers, and that took off in the 1830s onwards. And then obviously that was a very, very cheap method of producing wallpapers, much more viable. They perfected that technique, and you could buy good quality machine printed wallpapers, as well as, cheap as chips ones as well. They still carried on a hand block printing tradition for the very, very expensive. In much the same way as today, you can buy hand block printed wallpapers if you've got £100 per roll plus to spend on that. You can still get them today, but it was just very much for a very high end, top of the range market.
Okay. Anyone else like to ask a question? Yep.
Just interested in the affordability of wallpapers through the 1700s. You mentioned the tax, which sort of restricted what they could charge, but how affordable were they in today's prices, if you like?
It's very difficult to say, because it depends on various factors. I would say that they were moderately affordable. We don't have enough information to say this particular type of wallpaper costs this much, which equates to that in real terms today in comparison to anything else. So I wouldn't like to tell you that. I would say that it was something, so that's why we talk broadly about it was something that was affordable by the middle classes, somebody with a professional occupation, rather than somebody who was in the working classes and perhaps worked in a factory, or the printers themselves might have some, although there are tales of them stealing wallpapers, hiding them around the factory and taking them home. And there's quite a lot of evidence that people were producing counterfeit wallpapers. So you might not be able to afford a wallpaper on the legitimate market, but there was a big market for a big black market in wallpapers. People just not paying the tax, people stealing them, all sorts of things like that. So we can't be blanket rigid about who had what. And we don't have enough information about real terms, costs of food versus wallpaper for me to reliably tell you the answer to that.
Okay, thank you. Any time for another one? I've got a personal question. Oh, no, you can help.
You say the wallpaper tax will put on wallpaper, obviously, and with the French wallpaper coming in, surely knowing British governments like tax, did the tax the import, was there an import tax on the French?
Yes, there was. Yes, yes, there was. Yes, very good, very good. Yeah. And of course, that was in order to boost our industry, that was much more than we were paying on our tax. But they were relaxing regulations. Certainly after we'd finished having a war with Napoleon in 1815, we were then trading much more with France, and we were importing much more at a cheaper rate at that stage, which made it more affordable. But also we don't know very much about French manufacturers working in England. I mean, we know that Réveillon moved here and lived in England, but we don't know how many French craftsmen actually came over and bought those skills. Some English manufacturers employed French French printers. So there was another way for French wallpapers to be prevalent as well as importing them. But yes, that's a good point. It was at the whim of the tax system, but the very, very expensive French wallpapers would be for places like this, but there's certainly a lot of advertisements for them in general, so which suggests that there was a wide market for it. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Any more? I just had one. I was really interested in the Chinese wallpaper section that you talked about. Most of the Chinese wallpapers I've ever seen have either been on a white ground or quite a vibrant green or yellow ground. The one we've got, the surviving example we have here at Wentworth Woodhouse, is on a blue background, and I wondered if that was unusual.
Few blue background ones. Yeah, yes, there are. I'm just trying to think. Home House in London is one, and also Grimsthorpe Castle, I think, has one as well. Yeah, those darker coloured background Chinese wallpapers, quite often more a feature of the early 19th century rather than the 18th century. There's a bit of a resurgence of interest in Chinese wallpapers after the Brighton Pavilion, of course, George IV and his development of that. And that was quite a strongly coloured background. Before that, paler backgrounds, as you say, and so quite a lot of those have faded. So sometimes you see pink, which looks actually off-white, and then if a mirror is taken down, you can see the original colour behind. It's quite a vibrant pink or a yellow or something like that. So we have to take into account the fading of the background. But yes, more of a phenomenon of the later Chinese wallpapers, early 19th century.
Lovely. Thank you. Thanks very much. Before you leave tonight, you might want to actually see a few examples of bits of wallpaper that we've found in Wentworth Woodhouse. And we've got our facilities manager, Julie Reedman. I'm going to turn a light round so you can see the samples of wallpaper that she's got on the desk over there a bit more clearly. But I'd like to offer a huge thank you to Phillipa. That has been a fascinating evening. Ladies and gentlemen, our host for tonight, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
And just before we close the proceedings, just to mention to you that we are currently having the beautiful green dining room wallpaper cleaned at the moment. Well, when I say cleaned, partially touched up. I'm afraid it's beyond full cleaning, but we are having it stabilised, so it's being restuck to the wall where some of it has come away, which is a really important piece of work that we're doing currently. That is underway at the moment, so that room is closed because it has got arsenic and lead in some of the paint. So we're very careful from a health and safety point of view. But we're hoping that in the future you will be able to see that wallpaper.
we have about 6 wallpapers, old wallpapers. Okay, sorry. We have about 6 wallpapers available in the house, and next Tuesday we are running a conservation trail, and part of that trail is we're going to go and actually do a little bit of cleaning on our blue Chinese wallpaper that we have, and that's in a room that's not normally open to the public, so that's next Tuesday. And we are doing a bit of a project at the moment, trying to learn more about the historic wallpaper of the house. So if those, especially people who are local, who might know somebody who knows somebody, if you've got anybody who knows anything about historic wallpapers in Wentworth Woodhouse, do by all means get them to get in touch. Because we'd love to hear any stories you've got, or if your granny has a fragment of old wallpaper that was from Wentworth Woodhouse, we'd love to hear about it. So yeah, anything you have for us, that would be great. And if you do want to come and look at our wallpapers in the future, hopefully we'll have some more information about them as we learn more. Okay, thank you very much.